back extension, what exactly are we training? I put this poll up on my Instagram the other day asking people what exactly am I training while doing the back extension here, and the votes are more or less in, and this is the answer. So if you look at it, the majority of people assume that I'm actually training my glutes. 20% said hamstrings and 27% lower back. So what is the answer? What is the truth? To dive in, I want to kind of explain it. I've got some notes here, exactly it is that we're doing, that we're training, and why it matters. Why should you care? So the first thing I'm going to look at into is the back extension itself, and we're going to break down the anatomy, exactly the muscles involved in when we're training this exercise. The hyperextension can be done and modified like any other exercise for many different specifics, right? But today we're just taking the very standard. I've got a load in my hands, a very standard 45-degree back extension. Now this is a hip hinge movement. Essentially what it means is it is bending over with the neutral back and standing up. You are extending and locking out your hip. That is a hip hinge. If we look at the anatomy itself of the exercise, we can see that the majority of the muscles involved are the posterior chain. We refer to the posterior chain as the back chain of muscles. So things like your erectors, your glutes, your hamstrings, and your calves, and all the small things in between, right? Kind of highlight a picture here. We can see the anatomic skeletal system, that this is kind of the muscles that are engaged, and that's the muscles you feel when you do the back extension. Common problem, or especially in the beginners, when people come to train in the gym, they'll have a weak lower back. So a lot of us will put, a lot of good trainers will put a lot of beginner clients to do this exercise, to strengthen the posterior chain, to strengthen all the muscles involved, to help you save your lower back. If you're someone who sits in the office all day in a corporate job, if you're someone who's had back issues and you want to avoid back surgery, this machine is probably the most underrated thing that you're missing out and not using, and you should be using this. Having a strong posterior chain is so important because it's involved in all the exercises you do. If you want to look jacked, if you want to lose fat, and you want to build muscle, you need a strong posterior chain to lift heavy weights, because heavy weights are a signal, a stimulus that you send to your muscles to grow. If you have a weak link in the chain, you're more prone and likely to have injuries, right? So you want to make sure things are dialed in. So the back extension is imperative to be included in your training, for fat loss, for strength training, for injury prevention, basically for everything, right? But the movement itself is a hip hinge, and this is kind of like an anatomic skeletal system. Again, explaining kind of correct form of a hip hinge movement itself, where you have the spine kind of arched. You see, so a lot of people will also be stressed, like, oh, is my back too arched? So if you look here, I've got like I guess you could tell I've got like a mild arch in my back, but it's not exactly, again, a bad thing. If we take this example of me sitting up right here, I've got my toes and feet dug in. I've got a neutral spine, slight arch, if you will, and the range of motion is just that I'm lengthening the hamstring and I'm contracting the hamstring. The erectors are actually not working, so the lower back is actually not working as much as you think. So the erectors are actually not lengthening or stretching through the movement at all. They're just actively engaged, so you're not actually specifically training your lower back on this movement. Wanted to bias the glutes, you'd actually have to take your toes out a little bit and around the upper back. This forces the hips to drive into the cushion. Essentially, you're doing a reverse barbell hip thrust, which will bias the glutes a little bit more, even though the hamstring is still actively engaged. Now, what does this mean? Essentially, if we look at exercises in practical gym training, these are hip hinge exercises. If we look at exercises in real life and how you should program and why you should care, we can look at these three different exercises. You've got the Romanian deadlift on the left, you have a barbell Smith machine hip thrust, and you've got a good morning. Now, each of these exercises will work the hamstring and also the glutes. Your erectors are engaged, they are supported, but they are not actively being trained, just like in the back extension. So the erectors, or the lower back, is engaged and it is working, but it's not actively being trained. Your glutes, again, can be biased, specifically if we look at the hip thrust. Your glutes are engaged and they're the main prime mover. But even though it's still the hip hinge exercise, your hamstrings will work when you do the barbell hip thrust. It doesn't mean you're doing it wrong. It just means they're actively working because they're supported. They're a secondary muscle, so it's not a bad thing. Same when you're doing the Romanian deadlift. You might feel your lower back working, and you might say, "Oh, my lower back hurts, and I've got issues in my lower back." Now, unless you have a specifically diagnosed medical condition, injury, or herniated disc, or anything that might actually be the case, most of you just don't have a strong enough lower back. That is why it's important to include exercises like these in your training, because they're compounds. That's the first thing. So they're going to work a lot of muscles. They're going to have higher metabolic metabolic effect on your body, which means more muscle, more calories burned. Secondly, you're hitting a lot of muscles at the same time, so you're not just isolating, like, say, a bicep curl. Not only that, but if you're short in time, these also are very effective. Now, you can include either one of these exercises in a training program, or you could do a full training program by doing all three. So in this case, if you started with a heavy set of remaining deadlifts, which would be specifically working the glutes in the lengthened position, and the hamstrings and everything in the upper back and lower back. That includes something like a hip thrust on the Smith machine, which will work the glute in a shortened position, still a bit of erectors engaged and still a bit of hamstring engaged and all the other small muscles. And then something like a hamstring focused good morning. You can make this glute bias, you can make this hamstring bias by having knees either more locked out or slightly straighter. You would then cover through the whole posterior chain. And the only thing that I would say that's missing is some sort of rowing exercise, and you are good to go. Practical key takeaways to remember. You want to pick 2 to 4 of these hip hinge exercises that you can rotate through the week. So you don't need to go through all the movement patterns. You just need to pick 2 to 4 and rotate them through the week. So you can have workout 1 could be 2 hip hinge exercises, and workout 2 can have another 2 hip hinge exercises. You'll focus on sticking to the hypertrophy ranges, so 3 sets of 8 to 10 reps, give or take, with 1 to 2 reps in reserve. We're looking for intensity because that is the signal, that is the stimulus that will actually make your body change. And you can use a dumbbell, a barbell, or even a machine, which technically a Smith machine is a barbell, but a machine, potato. And if you kind of stick to this framework while including these exercises, you will develop a bulletproof back, really train your hamstrings and your glutes. Your training will also level up when your posterior chain gets stronger. As always, don't forget to hit the like, subscribe, and if you want to find out more, you can always check out the description underneath this video for more information about my coaching.